Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, CMC, pharmacovigilance, as well as medical writing. We offer 3 different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I am speaking with Harri Järveläinen. Hello, Harri. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining. I know that you're a consultant, and we're very much looking forward to working with you and assisting our clients. So, before we get into the topic for the day, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm independent consultant focusing on non-clinical and regulatory. About my background, I'm originally from Finland. I've been in pharma industry for 20 plus years. Educational background, I'm actually veterinarian and PhD in toxicology. So when I started at pharma, I started as a toxicologist at AstraZeneca, Sweden and Canada, and really doing toxicology all the time, and especially IND enabling space and taking programs into first in man phase 1 and beyond. And over the years, I've done lots of INDs, more than 30 of them. So that's still actually my bread and butter. I was for a while in Switzerland, and well, Switzerland is nice, but it's also a little bit boring. So when an opportunity came from China in 2012, I jumped into that opportunity. A friend of mine had actually a major company there, 30,000 people. So I started to work in China in 2012, and I still am in China actually most of the time. And I also met my wife in China, so that's one explanation also for the location. So yeah, so I worked for that company for 3 years, but then around 2015 I started to do this consulting, and the focus is non-clinical and regulatory and also operational and a little bit of CMC also. And I've also expanded, so I've actually taken an academic startup from academia all the way to clinic, and now the company is public in Nasdaq, so that was fun. But really, still today, independent consulting. And actually, what has been keeping me busy lately are Chinese CROs and auditing them and qualifying them and monitoring them and also CRO selection. So that has become a really busy area recently.
Well,
So I also have a residence in California, so sometimes I'm in the US.
okay. Well, I think that's a good segue into what we're going to be talking about today. So, what are we going to be talking about today, Harry?
Yeah, so Chinese CROs, I think that's a topic that, I mean, it's very popular. Most biotech companies, especially the smaller ones, they go to China to do studies. But I mean, there are lots of misconceptions, and I think it would be really informative if I told you about my personal and in-depth experiences about business in China and conducting studies at Chinese CROs and all the compliance aspects, and generally just making sure that things go right.
Well, I think your insight into what it is like over there is going to be very helpful for this podcast. The other thing that's going to be really helpful is to understand what you expect in the future, because we're at a fulcrum right now with the new administration coming in and bipartisan agreement that China is much more of a competitor, adversary than a friend and ally. And there's been a lot of conversation about trying to pull back some of the reliance on China. So I think for the purposes of this podcast, I want to know, what is the current state for every all of our listeners and let's talk about the misconceptions and all that stuff. And then we'll also try to tie in, is that going to remain the same in your opinion as we progress, or do you think things are going to change? So let's start at a high level. Give me an overview of the Chinese CRO landscape.
Yeah, so Chinese CRO industry, it started about 20 years ago. Most companies started around 2004, 2005, and they actually started typically as medicinal chemistry outfits, and then it expanded from there. Around those times, many Chinese professionals, industry professionals, they were moving back to China. They were called sea turtles, haiguo, and and then they started to work at those CROs because local biotech industry didn't really exist that time yet. So the expansion was rapid, and already around 2010, I think the biggest companies already had like 10,000 employees, and it was really already that time like a full service end to end, all areas of discovery and early preclinical development and manufacturing especially. So yeah, 2012 when I moved to China, that was actually a sort of turning point. So the government had lots of programs and initiatives that heavily supported biotech industry, innovative pharmaceutical development in China. And then really 2015, the whole industry absolutely, biotech industry exploded. So biotech companies started to mushroom in China, and it was actually a start of a bubble. So billions and billions went into pharmaceutical or biotech companies in China, and also the CRO industry uh, benefited from that a lot. So early times, actually, I would say almost 100% of clients were from the US, but during that boom, obviously, I mean, those Chinese companies then also started to work with Chinese CROs. So yeah, so it sort of become like 50-50 around that time. And but these times, well, the industry has matured, and I think those CROs, they have been operating for about 20 years, and now we are at the stage they are really, the quality wise, they can be one of the best really in the world. They are really great companies doing great work. And these days, big pharma, I think all big pharma companies, they do some work in China. But when it comes to smaller companies, and this includes especially the US, I think almost all companies at some point they do some work in China. So it's very difficult actually to imagine a situation where Chinese CRO would somehow disappear from
Mm.
the picture because it's so much integrated. It's so everybody's doing some work there, and it has benefited the innovation in the US over the
Mm.
years a lot. I cannot overemphasize that.
So let's talk about that then. So from a clinical standpoint, I've seen the maturity or the evolution of what that all looks like, right? So you did work in the United States and Western Europe, but there was a lot of competition with protocols. So Eastern Europe kind of became a really hotbed where you could get a lot access to a lot of patients and reasonable cost. I know Brazil was really good because of the concentration of populations in the different hubs. But the regulatory red tape, oftentimes, by the time you got the approval from Anvisa, you were already done your clinical study, right? And so we've heard murmurs about, the Asia Pacific and things of that. And Australia, I know there were some tax benefits, I think, with that. So as of today, if you were to try and paint a picture about the landscape, what does it look like from a clinical side? What does it look from a non-clinical side? And again, I want to, do I think CROs in China are going to, disappear because of the current conflict between the nations? I don't think so. What I would challenge you with is for the people that don't have a ton of information on this topic, what do they need to consider when deciding to work with CROs? Is there, in your opinion, no risk, or are there certain risks that people need to take into account?
Yeah, well, first about that clinical landscape, there was also a big change because back in 2012, it was actually super difficult to go to IND with the innovative molecule in China. The IND review took more than a year, maybe even 1.5 years.
Oh my
And
goodness.
it was a large non-clinical package that had to be support that. Also, CMC package was large. But in 2017, China joined the ICH. So that involves harmonization of all the guidelines. So basically, China can be now integrated into global clinical program quite seamlessly. So that benefited obviously local companies in China, and it benefits uh, global global companies going to China for IND and early clinical or integrating phase 3 studies, China into phase 3 studies. But yeah, so other than that, um, so this whole biosecure thing, and it's sort of political and it's mostly commercial. And actually, when it comes to CRO landscape, it affects mostly manufacturing. So, but the current version of the biosecure bill has not actually been approved yet, but I guess the expectation is that it will be approved sometime this year. It doesn't really, the current form include anything about non-clinical or clinical CROs. And actually, one common misconception is that it has nothing to do with regulatory aspects. So, for example, the US FDA doesn't care anything about you know, the Biosecure Act and all this politics. So, yeah, so it's very much business as usual for now. It's not approved yet. It doesn't affect the regulatory acceptance. But of course, what companies are concerned about is that it brings uncertainty. What next? Maybe it expands to include all kinds of other things. So that's definitely an uncertainty. And actually, that's one reason why I have been so busy recently, working with especially US companies, uh, monitoring and bringing more oversight into their programs at Chinese CROs.
Okay. So I'm listening to this podcast. Um, I have some non-clinical and clinical programs coming up. Um, I've heard about China. I want to go and work there, and I feel a level of confidence that based off of what you said about the bill and that's focus on manufacturing and the fact that government generally moves slow, that I don't think there's any going to be any real big disruption. So I'm going to move forward. I want to go and see what's going on in China. What are some of the benefits of Chinese CROs that either don't exist in other areas or maybe rare in other areas?
That don't exist. Well, maybe in non-clinical space, it's especially the primates. Most of the world's research primates come from China. They come from the southern part of China. So the supply chain is obviously, much easier. It's much cheaper to do studies involving primates. And of course, if there's a biological, especially like antibody, you have to do studies in 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 primates, and then China is the easiest option. Both
Yeah. And I'm
the
I'm
price.
gonna I'm gonna interrupt you right there because you
Yeah.
said the magic word, right? You said price. So everybody wants to know, okay, Harry, I kind of figured that, but how does it compare to US, Eastern Europe, India? Can you kind of create some clarity around that?
Um, yeah, so the price difference. during the pandemic, actually, the boom years here in the US, so 2020, 2021, the American CROs were very busy, and during those years, the price difference was sometimes absolutely crazy. I've seen offers from US CROs that were up to 10 times more expensive than in China. But now it has sort of stabilized, and I would say routinely the price difference, if it involves primates, for example, it can be 3 to 4 times cheaper to do those studies in China. And one important aspect is also the lead time. So the Chinese CROs, they actually the biggest ones now, they have their own colonies and own vendors. So they have an in-house supply of research primates. So the lead times can be very short, just 2 months, let's say 2 months for GLP tox, while in the US that can be 6 months. You mentioned India. India actually, for a long time, it was only possible to do like a rodent studies, GLP toxicology studies in rodents, but the law changed there, and it's now beginning to be possible to do, especially dog studies, and I'm not sure about primates, but they are also entering the picture. So actually, in India, the pricing can be similar or even cheaper than in China. But I would say that when it comes to experience and quality, I mean, there's just less history in Indian CRO space. So it's not, I would say, how to say this, they're not yet at the same level as the most established CROs in China. But
Well,
there's
we
also
know,
jobs.
yeah, we know in the late teens, there was a big push from FDA on data integrity, and um, India got the spotlight and China not as much. So I think that's something that we can recognize out loud. I want to continue moving this conversation. As we start to transition to other topics, I just want to uh, once again go through what are some of the things that would be hard to replicate elsewhere that China is unique in providing, and that you have touched on a little bit here and there, some of the misconceptions. So again, as we progress to other topics, I want you to reiterate what haven't you mentioned already that is beneficial about Chinese CROs and hard to replicate elsewhere, and what are some of the common misconceptions?
Yeah, hard to replicate. So yeah, the pricing and the speed, that's difficult to replicate. But then there are also certain, I mean, capabilities are, I think you know, there are some capabilities that some US CROs don't do. For example, technically challenging non-clinical studies, such as things like continuous infusion studies in rodents, which are technically super challenging. You can do those in China, and most US CROs don't even want to do those studies because they are kind of risky also to conduct. And then there are some specialized things like, well, obesity. It's popular these days, so there are CROs in China that have obese monkeys. There's one big CRO in China that has like 1,000 overweight monkeys at their facility, so something like that
It's
doesn't
an
exist.
unusual capability.
Yeah, so things like that, like a specific niches, you can find things like that uh, in China. But when it comes to those misconceptions, so there are many, and maybe it's about there's lots of resentment, really, like realistically.
I'm going to interrupt you because as you're
Sure.
going through the misconceptions,
Yeah,
I'd also like you to tell me what are some of the stereotypes that, in your opinion, have proven true?
have proven true.
Yeah, so you're going to spend most of your time talking about the misconceptions,
Yeah,
and there might be some things where, well, I think China has this issue or problem or risk, and you'll say, a lot of these are misconceptions. That one, that's not a misconception, that's a reality.
yeah. So one thing that is a problem for US sponsors is the language and the communication. And actually, when I moved to China 2012, um, younger Chinese people were very much into learning English. There were these English learning institutions everywhere. You can notice it. But somehow it's more inward now, and Chinese internet, it is own closed ecosystem, and there's no more exposure to English, and you can notice that.
Hmm.
So it has actually frustrated me that young study directors at CROs, their English skills are clearly not at the same level as they were 10, 15 years ago. So that's a problem. But I mean, it can be handled. It's just more work for you as a sponsor to work on the, for example, study reports, try to improve their English. So that's a frustration to many sponsors, but I think it's something that can be handled.
Why don't you
Other,
touch on that? So I'm a listener. I thought that was an issue. You've confirmed it's an issue. Rather than me trying to figure out how to deal with that challenge, what have you seen that's probably, this is the easiest way to handle that? I mean, I've got a concept in my head, but I'll let you speak from experience.
um, well, the CROs have started to handle this. What I've seen more and more, they have sort of like a project management arrangement. So there is a person who is facilitating the communication, like a project manager who speaks good English and, sort of keeps communication and things in general under control. So that definitely helps. And actually, when you are starting your programs at Chinese CRO, so you can also influence the specific people you work with. So it's good to sort of try to get to know your study director in advance and figure out if, what is their English skills and, how communicative they they are. So that's one way to do it. Or and in addition to that, actually, then you can have um, well, Chinese people from your own side or independent consultant who can handle that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would like to clarify that it's everything is still in English. I mean, the SOPs of those CROs and all the operations, everything's still in English in addition to Chinese. So it's like a dual language operations, and all the reports, they are in English. So it doesn't affect that really.
Okay. Any other misconceptions you want to touch on before I pursue to the next topic?
Well, one misconception that I hear often are these IP concerns. And you hear all these sort of horror stories, what happened some time ago. And actually, then when you go into details, those stories are quite old. And it's true that things were wild in China. I would say especially early 2000s, 2005 until 2010. And even I think it was around 2007, the head of Chinese FDA was sentenced and executed for corruption. So
I
all kinds of,
remember that.
yeah, so all kinds of
When was
things.
that?
Pardon?
When was that?
I think it was around 2007, 2008.
It was that long ago?
Yes. Yeah.
Jesus.
But but it's things are solid now. And China is a big country, so there are thousands of CROs. I don't know the exact number, but of course you can find anything from the bottom to the very top. And one way actually to mitigate this is to stick to the biggest, most established CROs. And things are very solid there. And
Mm.
I've never felt, I don't want to name any CROs specifically, but working with, I want to stick to those biggest names and most established names. And I've never seen anything sketchy or I would never think they would do anything sketchy with the IP. And those biggest CROs are also audited by one of those big four consulting firms, and there are audits all the time, hundreds of times probably at some of those biggest audits, and I've never heard that anything really comes up. I'm personally, I don't think the most common concern or misconception is the IP, so I never encountered any
Mhm.
concerns.
Thank you for that. And then when you're talking about working with the biggest CROs, just as a risk mitigation strategy, I would definitely subscribe to that for people that are coming into China for the first time. And this is kind of the maturity that I talk about when it comes to clinical is if this is your first time running a study, go to the big CRO and this is not meant to insult or demean big CROs, but just as a general rule of thumb, you can expect to pay a high price for moderate quality. The nice thing is they do everything for you. They've got great processes and you can expect good results, right? As you start to become more experienced in the clinical space, then you can start playing around with the idea of functional service providers. And there, the negative is it's going to require more management on your side because now you've got multiple FSPs across multiple clinical programs. But the benefit, just to be broad, is you're going to get a better quality at a lower cost. But there's different places for different people depending on their experience. So, to your point, I would definitely say if this is your first time going in, don't take a chance, go with the most established. And then as you become more experienced and aware of the different options in China, then you can kind of start to meander and, see if there might be other fits.
Yeah.
Which thank you for that because now I want to get into, okay, I'm a listener. Um, I want to go, okay, you've said go with the big CRO. If that's it, then we're done. But that's not it. So what else do people need to consider when they're assessing and selecting CROs in China?
Uh, if you are a US-based biotech company, early stage, or actually want to submit to the US FDA, one critical aspect is the US FDA inspection history. And well, in the US, the FDA inspects local CROs and those places regularly, every couple of years. It's not that kind of scheduled program overseas, including China. So in China, the US FDA typically inspects CROs every 3 to 4 years. And that inspection frequency actually depends very much on the submission volume to the agency. So they get submissions, the studies conducted at the Chinese CRO, so then they go and inspect the place. So that's critical. And that's actually great for a US sponsor or company because if the CRO has been inspected, let's say within the past 3, 4 years, it's sort of green light for your program because
Depending on what the findings were.
depending, yes. And another critical aspect is okay, you figure out when was the last US FDA inspection, then you have to look into the 483 letter. Because in non-clinical space, 48, there's going to be a 483 letter all the time. I mean, manufacturing, it's a little bit of a big of a deal, but in non-clinical space, it happens every time because there are just so many moving parts. So look into the 483 letter. What are the findings in that letter? And so the CRO actually should be willing, and there should be no problem for the CRO to show you the redacted version of that letter. So I
Redacted version of the 43?
yes, so
Well,
they
that's
should
that's that's public information that you can get through a FOIA request.
exactly,
So
exactly.
I don't know why it would be redacted, but continue.
Exactly. So normally I get they have redacted somewhere, and they should be willing to do that because you can get it through, freedom
They
of
shouldn't be
information.
redacting it, but if that's the cultural norm, then that's the cultural norm. I
Yeah.
think the natural, consequence of that is to go. Now, I know you can get it through FOIA, but that takes a while. I think there are some other organizations and their business model is built on requesting all of those FOIAs and then selling them to people so they don't have to wait the 4 months.
Yeah.
So yeah, continue.
Yeah. So that's very informative, obviously. And the FDA inspections, they do good work. It's a great agency, and they typically send a team of 3 inspectors to those CROs. They spend 5 days there, and yeah, so you get a good picture. Chinese CROs often inspect OECD inspectors. They invite people from some of those European countries, and then they issue GLP certification, which is kind of weird term because the US FDA doesn't use that, but they do that every 2, 3 years. And that actually, I didn't pay much attention to that. I mean, what does GLP certification from some European country mean? But actually, these days, it's starting to be meaningful also because China is not part of OECD. And OECD, well, it's like a club of rich countries, and China is not a member of it. European countries are North American and Japan and Australia and so on. So China is not a member. So that also means that OECD member countries do not have to accept automatically GLP data from China. So that used to be an issue with certain European countries because maybe there was one individual who just didn't like, the fact getting Chinese, for example, GLP tox data, so they didn't want to approve that. But now the submission processes, including CTAs in Europe, are centralized. So they go to the EMA first, and EMA actually is willing to approve now, sort of, it looks like sort of automatically submissions, also including Chinese data, if that CRO has been inspected by a OECD authority within the last 3 years. So it's a sort of same sort of green light process as it is with the US FDA.
Okay, thank you. Anything else that you would like to discuss as it pertains to CRO assessment and selection or regulatory and compliance challenges before we move into cultural and operational considerations?
Well, it's a regulatory expectation actually that as a sponsor, you need to have an oversight of your CLP studies or GMP also. Yeah, uh, so basically, uh, like a good way to do this would be first to qualify your CRO. So maybe send an auditor, maybe in-house quality people or an independent consultant to that CRO and do like a formal qualification process and document that. And then when you have your study ongoing, you should monitor that at a critical phase, ideally like first dosing day or sometime during the in life of the study, and also document that. So if there are any hiccups along the way, regulatory hiccups, then you always will have that documentation showing that you know uh, that can help you if there's any problem along the way.
Mhm. Okay. Um, so what cultural or operational challenges do Western biopharma companies face when working with Chinese CROs?
But yeah, the culture is different, and I would say first on a positive note that um, so things get done in China. So Chinese people, they do work a lot, and it's actually scary for somebody like me from Northern Europe, where we have summer holidays 6 weeks, and then in China, it's just more so much more productive. Things get done so much quicker. So that's actually culturally like really positive, and but otherwise, I mean, it's I actually don't see that many issues with that. It's maybe the language issue, language barrier comes in a little bit sometimes, but other than that, it's yeah, it's people have the same background and they are professionals like us. So I don't see many issues there operationally. We talked about those IP concerns.
Well,
Sometimes actually,
we'll stop there because that's exactly where I was going to go.
okay.
Okay, so I'm listening to you talk, Harry, and you're saying, look, in my experience over these years, have I seen a lot of that IP stuff happening? I haven't. I know it
Yeah.
happened in the past, but it hasn't, it's really not a common thing. Okay. I'm a listener and I'm saying that's okay, Harry, but I am really scared. And I am not willing to take your anecdotal evidence on this. What can I do to protect myself? I want to go in China. I want to be able to work with them because of all the benefits that come from that. How do I protect myself?
So normally at the stage where you go, for example, you start working with CROs at the preclinical stage, you normally do have your IP secured. So first of all, that should protect you. And then, as I mentioned, those biggest CROs in China, they are audited all the time. They have robust processes to protect the IP of sponsors. So that's one way also. I mean, there are these smaller CROs, and I don't know about their processes, and actually their clientele actually is mostly Chinese also, so might be more difficult to work with them anyways. Other than that, I mean, maybe the key is really to have your IP secured before you, and that's normally the case.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
This has been a very good podcast.
Thank you.
I really thank you for your insight on this topic. What would you like to leave the audience with before we close?
Well, it was a pleasure, and I hope that this has been educative to your listeners and maybe help with all those sort of unknowns or maybe even misconceptions that some people may have. And yeah, so I'm also happy to help if anybody needs help in this area.
Okay, super. Well, Harry, thank you again. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you have not already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you all next time.